In the chilling winds of the Himalayas, two Asian giants once clashed in a war that would reshape their future forever. The year was 1962. India and China, two newly independent nations with ancient civilizations, were dragged into a sudden and brutal war high in the mountains. It was a war that lasted barely a month, but its impact is still felt today. The seeds of this conflict were sown long before the first bullet was fired. At the heart of the dispute were territorial claims, specifically over Aksai Chin in the west and Arunachal Pradesh, then called the Northeast Frontier Agency in the east. To understand the war, we must first rewind to 1947, when India gained independence from British rule. The borders India inherited were based on colonial-era agreements, including the McMahon Line, drawn in 1914 between British India and Tibet. China, having never accepted British imperial claims, refused to recognize the McMahon Line. They argued that Tibet was never a sovereign entity, and thus could not have entered into treaties. Meanwhile, in 1950, China annexed Tibet. India protested, but chose not to confront its northern neighbor. Instead, Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru adopted a peaceful approach, believing that diplomacy and mutual respect would solve the issue. His slogan was, "Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai," meaning Indians and Chinese are brothers. But relations began to deteriorate rapidly. In 1957, India discovered that China had quietly built a road through Aksai Chin, linking Tibet to Xinjiang. This was land that India considered its own, but China now controlled it militarily. Tensions increased further in 1959, when the Dalai Lama fled Tibet after a failed uprising against Chinese rule and was granted asylum in India. This infuriated China. Over the next few years, border skirmishes became more frequent. India followed the so-called forward policy, establishing outposts along the disputed borders to assert its territorial claims. However, these outposts were often isolated and poorly supplied, vulnerable in the face of a better prepared Chinese military. Then came October 20th, 1962. In a surprise and coordinated assault, Chinese forces attacked Indian positions in both the western sector, Ladakh, and the eastern sector, Arunachal Pradesh. Indian troops, caught off guard, were poorly equipped, ill-clothed for the high-altitude conditions, and lacked proper infrastructure. In Aksai Chin, Chinese troops quickly overwhelmed Indian positions. Indian soldiers, many without snow gear or winter protection, struggled to hold their ground. In the Eastern Front, the situation was even more alarming. The Chinese launched a full-scale offensive across the McMahon Line, advancing rapidly through the dense forests and mountains of Arunachal Pradesh. Despite fierce resistance from Indian troops, the Chinese forces proved to be more organized and better supplied. They captured key areas like Tawang and Walong. Indian command was in disarray, and reinforcements were hard to move through the rugged terrain. By early November, India was facing a national crisis. Prime Minister Nehru, once confident about India's preparedness, was forced to appeal for international help. The United States and the United Kingdom responded with offers of military aid. But before any major foreign support could materialize, something unexpected happened. On November 21, 1962, China declared a unilateral ceasefire and announced a withdrawal from the eastern sector, though it continued to hold Aksai Chin in the west. The reasons behind this sudden halt remain debated. Some suggest that China never intended to wage a long war. It only wanted to teach India a lesson and consolidate its claim over Aksai Chin. India suffered a humiliating defeat. Over 1,300 Indian soldiers were killed, more than 3,800 were taken as prisoners, and thousands went missing or were wounded. China too suffered casualties, though it never released exact numbers. The war shattered India's self-image. Nehru, who had championed peace and diplomacy, was heartbroken. His health declined rapidly after the war, and he passed away 2 years later in 1964. The Indian government realized the urgent need to modernize its military and invest in infrastructure along the border regions. For China, the war served as a message to its neighbors. It would defend its claims aggressively. It also strengthened the Communist Party's control under Mao Zedong, boosting nationalistic pride. But perhaps the greatest consequence was the deep mistrust it created between the two nations. Even today, more than 60 years later, the border dispute is unresolved. India still claims Aksai Chin, while China continues to claim Arunachal Pradesh as part of South Tibet. Occasional standoffs and clashes, such as the Doklam crisis in 2017 and the Galwan Valley conflict in 2020, are reminders that the shadow of 1962 still looms large. The India-China War of 1962 was not just a battle over borders. It was a clash of visions, strategies, and political ideologies. It taught both nations painful lessons about preparedness, diplomacy, and trust. As history shows, wars are not always fought for land alone. Sometimes they are battles of pride, perception, and power. And the 1962 war remains one of the most important, yet often forgotten, chapters in the complex relationship between two rising powers of the modern world.